I said those were not the main symptoms at the time that this happened, but they had been symptoms in the past, and they are part of the diagnosis that the Dr. Flores will testify to. Now, I think most people understand what depression is. It's basically an inability to function. It's a sadness. It's a lack of energy, a lack of interest in doing any of the things you would normally do. I think most people have a feel for that. Mania is a little different. Mania is the opposite. Mania is an extremely high or elevated mood, and it's often inflated self-esteem or grandiosity. You think you are more than you are. It's a significant decreased need for sleep. You may only need 2 or 3 hours of sleep a night. Typically, you're more talkative, you're more outgoing than usual. There are flights of ideas or racing thoughts often. Often that can lead to good things at work, to creativity, to getting a lot done, to taking on extra projects. One of the symptoms is what's called an increase in goal-related activities. And if those goal-related activities are projects at work and getting things done at work, it can actually help you. Typically also what goes with it, though, is irritability and high-risk behaviors. And that's where mania gets people in trouble. And we'll talk about some of the high-risk behaviors that we saw in Hemy's previous life, in previous manic episodes. Now, the issue that you're going to have to decide in this case is not whether or not Hemy Neuman shot Rusty Sneiderman. The issue is whether or not he had the mental capacity to distinguish between right and wrong. So basically, whether he had a delusion that made him believe he was doing the right thing, that he was protecting the children. That's the question you will have to ask. And we will give you the tools you need to make that decision through this trial. Now, to understand Hemy's mental illness, to understand Hemy's history and how we got here, we really have to back up to his childhood, and we have to back up to his father. In 1994, Mark Neumann, Hemy's father, was captured by the Nazis. He and 112 of his family members.
Come up, lawyers. I'm going to sustain that objection. Let's move on.
Starting with Hemy's childhood, Hemy grew up in a household with an abusive alcoholic father and a mother who dealt with that problem by leaving. Now, his mother is here in court with him today. She will be here throughout the trial. She has gotten her life together. She is supportive now, but when he was a child, she was very, very young, and she didn't know how to deal with the situation, and she dealt with it by leaving. She would travel to stay with family outside the country. He was growing up initially in Mexico, then later in Puerto Rico. When she was home, she would be gone every night and then sleep through the day. She was not really a part of his upbringing. And what that did was that left he and his younger sister basically to raise themselves. And Hemy was a very bright young man. He was a very sad young man, but he was a very bright young man. Unfortunately, his sister didn't have that same advantage. His sister had a lot of difficulties and ended up repeating first grade a couple of times, repeating second grade. She needed help. And as a child, Hemy tried to protect her and tried to help them through this situation. And that continued until he was 13. Now, at 13, his mother was out of town. She wasn't there. And his father came and said, Hemy, you need to pack up everything you've got. I'm sending you to school in Israel. Now, remember, Hemy had grown up in Mexico and in Puerto Rico. He didn't speak the language. He had no ties to Israel, but they shipped him off to a boarding school for underprivileged children in Israel. He packs up. His father puts him on a plane. He's traveling alone. The first leg is to New York with his brother who's headed to college, but after that he has to change planes and he has to make his way to Israel. Now, when he gets on the plane, his father gives him a piece of paper that has two pieces of information. It has his home phone number, which of course he knew, and it has the name of the school. So he gets into Israel, he gets off the plane, it's about midnight, and there's no one there from the school to pick him up. The flight had been delayed, there's no one there. He manages to find a taxi, and he gives the driver the paper with the name of the school, and the driver drives him out into the countryside to the gates of a school and lets him out. And he's there with his little red vinyl suitcase, and there's a security guard that comes out. And what he told the doctors is, this man looked like Quasimodo to me. This is an older man who doesn't speak my language, who's kind of hunched over. We can't communicate. He finally just opens the gate and lets Hemy walk in somewhere around 1 a.m. into this school. And he eventually finds some counselors. They eventually get him settled. Now, during the first several weeks of school, he's sick basically the whole time. He's in the infirmary most of that first several weeks. He's not in class. He's not functioning very well. Until then, he'd always been very, very healthy. But all of this ends up making him very ill. And there comes a point where he finds out that the way this school is set up, you don't just stay full time. Every time there's a Jewish holiday, which is every few weeks, everyone has to go home and they close the school down. Well, he has nowhere to go. Home is in Puerto Rico. No one has told him about any relative. No one has told him where he can go. The first time this happens, a nurse takes him home. After that, they try and find students to invite him home. And what he told the nurse is, I still remember the pity in their eyes. I still remember the look in their eyes when I came into their homes. They didn't even know me, and they're having to take care of me. And eventually he reaches the point, as he's frankly sinking more and more into depression at this school, where he says, no, I'm not doing it anymore. I want to stay at the school. Well, they can't let him stay in the dorms because there's no one there. But there was a dairy farm actually on the school property where he worked that had an outbuilding that they called the shack. And they finally agreed, well, you can stay in the shack. We'll put a cot in there. We'll give you blankets. They got an employee that lived near the school to come and set food outside the kitchen for him to go pick up. But he was allowed to stay there. And the first time he stayed there is the first time he has an episode with what he calls a demon. And this being comes to him and tells him, come and be with me. Come and join me. And that is a theme that will recur as that same being comes to him again later through his life. At this point, he doesn't want to live anymore. He doesn't want to continue. But of course, he's 13. He doesn't really have options. He gets through that weekend. He gets through the next couple of weeks. And at that point, he's essentially rescued. He has His brother, his older brother, is actually a half-brother. His mother, when she was 16, was married in Israel, had his older brother. They divorced, but the father, his older brother's father, was still in Israel. He had remarried to a woman named Neely, who will be important later. And that couple found out through relatives that Hemy was in Israel. And they tracked him down and they went to the school and they introduced themselves. And they said, come stay with us for the holidays. Come be part of our family for the holidays. And from that point forward, that is basically the first time Hemy had traditional parents. Parents who were married, who were together, who loved him and supported him and took care of him. And he would consider them his parents basically throughout his life. By the end of his high school years, they would introduce him as their son. Now, that first year, his father never visited him. He had no contact with his mother. He was just alone in Israel with now these essentially adopted parents, with Willie and Neely, but he was alone. At the end of the year, he ends up going back to Puerto Rico. And when he gets home, his mother is there. His parents sit he and his younger sister down, and they say, our marriage is failing, which of course he knew, and we're thinking about getting a divorce. And they basically ask him for permission to get a divorce. And at that point, he just throws up his hands and says, look, this isn't something I can tell you what to do. You do what you're going to do. I'm leaving. He contacts on his own the school. He makes arrangements to go back, and he returns to Israel, where he will eventually graduate from high school. So from that point on, he is out of that household. His sister's still at home, but he's out of that household. Now, while he is home that summer, his parents come to him and say, what do you think about your sister? Should we send her to school in Israel as well? And he tells them no, because she's never done well in school, because she also doesn't speak Hebrew, because of the nature of the school and the students with special needs there. He tells them, no, I don't think it's a good idea. I don't think it's safe for her. And that is something that he, to this day, deals with the guilt of not being able to stay with her and not being able to protect her, and telling them to keep her at home. But that first incident, that first state of depression in 1977 is where all of this starts. That feeling of being orphaned, of being alone, the demon coming to him. That's where all of this starts. The next episode that Dr. Flores will talk to you about was in 1981. And by then he had graduated from high school. He had been accepted into Georgia Tech here in Atlanta. And he was doing very, very well. For the first several semesters at school, he was on the dean's list. He was doing well. He was active. And then he hit another depressive episode. And for an entire semester, he basically didn't get out of bed. He couldn't get himself to class. He couldn't get himself to do the work. He couldn't get himself to do any additional activities, to go out with friends. He basically slept through a semester. And you'll have the transcripts of his grades while he was at Georgia Tech, and you'll see every semester consistently he's dean's list, he's doing well, and then there's one semester where his grades plummet. That summer, he went home, and he and his sister were there alone most of the time, and he basically continued in that same state. And she will come and she will testify about their childhood, but she will also testify about that summer and how he spent an entire summer on the couch. He had a car, he had cousins, he had friends to go out and visit with that he hadn't seen in a while, but he wouldn't go out, he wouldn't go out with her, he wouldn't do anything. He just spent the summer on the couch. But then he got better. He came out of the episode. He went back to school. He went back to being on the dean's list. He went back to excelling. He graduated from Georgia Tech. And he went back to Israel to work. He got a degree as an aerospace engineer. He went back, got a job in the aerospace industry, found out he is very good at organizing large projects. He's very good at organizing large groups to work on projects. He moved up in his company. He was doing well. In 1990, he met his wife, Relly. They almost immediately started a family. They had 2 twins, Lee and Tom, and they had a daughter shortly after that. He was doing well. Then, in 1998, he had his first manic episode. Now, as I said, he's doing well. He's 36 years old. He's married. He's got 3 children. They own a house. They own cars. His company loves him. His reviews are all good. And all of a sudden, he comes home and he says, we're moving to the U.S. We're moving to Florida. We're moving to Boca Raton. Now, he had some family down there, but he had no ties to Boca Raton. He had no reason to think he could get a job there. He had no reason to think he could work there. But he packed the family up. They sold the house that they loved. They sold their cars. They made a little bit of money on the house. They moved down to Boca Raton. They bought a house. They bought cars. They enrolled all 3 children in an expensive private school down there. They proceeded to renovate the house. And he had nothing. He had no job. He had no income. They were living on the money that they made from the house. And they continued like that for a year. He eventually did a little bit of work for a recruiting company, made a tiny amount of money, but never worked in his industry, never did what he was trained to do that entire year until they just ran out of money and had to go back to Israel. Now, luckily, his company was happy to take him back. They had been happy with him before. He goes back to work, and he recovers. He builds his career. He does well, and eventually he ends up with General Electric. And in 2005, he and his family move to Atlanta. Now, this time he transfers within General Electric. Now, there may have been another manic episode at that time, but he does it right. It motivates him to move and to change and to take a lower paying job, but it's a good career decision. He comes to Atlanta, he does well, and that's where he was working when all of this happened. The next episode is in 2008. Now, by then, he's working in Atlanta. When they first moved to Atlanta, his wife fell in love with a house that they couldn't really afford, but they managed. So they took on a huge mortgage. At first, they were living kind of beyond their means. They were building up a little bit of debt. But he had a good job. He was moving up. It wasn't the end of the world. In 2008, that kind of fell apart. He went into another manic episode. Now, at first, he just had a lot of energy. He was only sleeping 3 or 4 hours a night. He was irritable. He told the doctors, I was a terror to my employees, but he was getting stuff done. He actually ended up essentially taking on 2 full-time jobs into one job, taking on extra projects at work. There was a $65 million budget problem at GE in his department that he was able to resolve. He was doing well at work, taking advantage of all this extra energy and all the good things of mania. But at home, things were falling apart. At home, the risk-taking behavior started to show up. He started overspending. He took his 2 oldest, the twins, were graduating from high school, getting ready to go to college at Georgia Tech. He took the family on a vacation. Then he took the family on another vacation. and another vacation. And in 1 year, they managed to take about 5 vacations. He bought his wife a very expensive diamond ring as they're getting more and more in debt. They had some trees that needed to come down in the yard, and all of a sudden he decided, instead of spending a couple $1,000s to have trees taken down, we've got to redo the entire yard and spend $35,000 on landscaping. He was just spending and spending. He was also day trading. Now, day trading is, in theory, what you're doing is you're buying and selling stocks and holding them for very short periods of time, but you're making tiny profits on each sale, and over time, over thousands of sales, you will make money. However, he was working full-time, essentially doing 2 jobs. He had never done day trading before. He didn't know what he was doing. In the first couple of months of 1999, he did over 2,000 transactions, over $9 million in purchases and sales, and lost money. Because he didn't know what he was doing, but he was very active in doing it. And by the end of that year, they had built up about $77,000 in credit card debt in addition to their mortgage. And that is the financial situation that he was in at the start of 2010. Now, in February of 2010, he had another depressed episode. His marriage was having problems. They were having serious financial problems. They were trying to put together a debt consolidation plan, but they were going to have to go into a very, very tight budget. He had an evaluation at work that wasn't bad, but it wasn't what he had hoped for, and it wasn't the kind of evaluation that was going to lead to an immediate promotion, which is what he was hoping for. And the depression started to return. And while he was on a business trip to Greenville, he was driving home, and that same demon that he saw in high school came back and started telling him, "You're a failure," telling him, "Come to me," urging him to commit suicide. And for the first time, he decided to do it. He had passed some construction on the road where there were cement sections out on the road, and he decided he was going to drive his car into that cement. So he actually pulled off, got off the highway, got ready to turn around and go back, and then started thinking about his children and started thinking about what this would do to them. And decided no, he couldn't do it. So he got back on the road and he continued on. And he eventually started to come out of that depression. And that is where he was when he first met Andrea Sneiderman. Andrea Sneiderman, he hired in May. She actually started in April. When she started, one of the things that she was going to have to do was to go out to all of the sites across the country that she would be working with and meet the people she'd be working with. She was based in Atlanta, just like Hemy, but she would be working with sites all around the country and also sites overseas, and she needed to meet these people. And when Hemy had that evaluation, one of the things they told him was, you need to get out and you need to see these people face to face. You need to meet with these people face to face. You need to go to the sites that you supervise and meet with your people. So when she started, they agreed some of these trips that she was going to have to take, he would go with her, he would introduce her to the people she needed to know, and he would get his trips in as well. In May, they take their first trip. And this is a normal business trip to Melbourne, Florida. They start to get to know each other. They have time in the evenings to have dinner. They start to talk. they just start to get to know each other. In June of 2010, at the very beginning of the year, Neely Gaffney, the mother that he had in Israel, the woman who was married to his brother's father, passed away. And he went back to Israel for the funeral. And because of that, all of those memories from his childhood, all of those memories from what happened in Israel started to come back. When he gets back, he and Andrea go on a trip to Norfolk, Virginia. And that night, after they've met with all the people they needed to meet with, they go to dinner. They have a dinner with wine. They start to talk. She starts to share with him what's going on in her household and the problems she's having. Now, until she started at GE, she had been a mother who worked from home. She had done IT for Harvard. She had a very good job, but she could do it from home, so she was home with the kids. And Rusty, her husband, worked outside the house. Now, shortly before she was hired at GE, that switched. Rusty quit his job and was trying to start a company, so he was going to be working from home, but didn't have any income at the time. And she was going to take a job outside the home to support the family. So all of a sudden, she's not the one taking care of the kids, it's Rusty. He's got to get them to school, he's got to pick them up after school, he's got to take them to ballet or sports or whatever they have in the afternoons, he's got to make sure they have dinner, he's got to take care of them. And not only that, she's traveling. A lot of the time, he's the only one there, even in the evenings. And that was causing problems. That was a major change for them, and they were having to resort out how to run their household, how to run their relationship. So when she went out to dinner with Hemy, she was sharing the difficulties that she and Rusty were having and her concerns about the children. And for the first time, Hemy shares with her what happened in Israel. Now, he had told other people, I went to a boarding school in Israel, I was alone there. He had told people the events, but he had never told anyone the emotion that went with those. He had never told anyone how alone he felt. He had never told anyone about the experience staying in the shack. All of those emotional details, even his wife didn't know. And he starts to share those with Andrea because he's thinking about them after losing Neely. In July of 2010, they have another trip to Minden, Nevada. Now, Minden is close to Lake Tahoe. And that night, after they go to dinner, they share a bottle of wine, they walk out to the lake to look at the stars, and he reads her a poem that he's written, and he tells her, I love you. And they kiss very briefly, really just a peck. But he tells her how he feels. He tells her that he thinks he's falling in love with her. And she says no. She says, I'm married, I have kids, that's not going to happen. She shuts him down. Now, she does admit to him that she has feelings and that she's had some fantasies, but she says, no, that's not going to happen. I'm married, I'm never leaving my husband. Shuts it down. After they get back, he's at dinner with his family, with his wife and some friends, and he has the first hallucination. And a being, what he describes to the doctors as an angel, appears. It's very different from the demon. This is a warm being. This is someone who he sees as on his side, as helping him. And the angel tells him, the children are yours. And he says, what children? And she says, Ian and Sophia. Andrea's children. They're yours. And you have to go and tell Andrea. And that night he excuses himself. He goes outside. He gets on the phone. Andrea is supposed to be flying to Colorado the next day on a business trip. Now, she's going alone. This is a training. This has nothing to do with him, but he knows where she's going to be staying. And he gets on the phone and he calls the hotel, and he tells them, I need you to go out, and I need you to buy chocolates, and I need you to buy flowers, and I need you to leave them in Andrea's room. And the guy on night shift basically puts him off and says, well, I don't know if we can do that. I'll talk to my boss. Call back later. He continues calling and continues calling and continues calling. And he dictates a love note to be left in the room for her. And he tells them, I'm coming later. He tells them, buy these chocolates, buy these flowers. I'm coming down later this week. I'll pay you back. And he does. He flies to Colorado. Now remember, this is not a business trip for him. He's not supposed to be in Colorado. He's supposed to be in Atlanta. He's got a job. He and his wife are on a very, very tight budget. And he's flying to Colorado. He shows up, calls Andrea. She picks him up at the airport and takes her to dinner. And he tells her, if you search the world over, you would never find a better father to Ian and Sophia. And she cuts him off. She won't let him continue that conversation. She won't let him tell her what he wants to tell her. She just says, no, I don't want to hear it. I'm married. I've got children. I don't want to hear it. Completely shuts him down. However, she does let him come back and stay with her at the hotel. And you'll have a stipulation showing that she actually changed her room from a room with a smaller bed to a room with a larger bed, and from one person to two persons. So we know she let him stay that night, or stay the night, but she wouldn't let him tell her what he wanted to tell her. And they do spend that night in the same bed. There is almost certainly no sex. Now, the reason I say almost certainly is when the doctors interviewed Hemy, he was very unclear, and is still very unclear, on what was in his mind, what was his fantasies, his delusions, and what was actually happening. So we're basically looking at Andrea's emails, at other sources, to figure out at what point their relationship became physical. Now, in August of 2010, Hemy and Andrea go to Greenville. They end up going twice, so this is Greenville 1. And again, Andrea is complaining about Rusty, complaining about problems with the children, talking about the children. And every time she talks about the children, every time she talks with Hemy about how to brainstorm solving problems with taking care of the children, that just reinforces that delusion that these children are his and that they are making decisions together about these children. On August 18th, she actually introduces him to Rusty. They sit down, they have lunch, they talk about the possibility of Hemy looking for another job and whether Rusty has contacts that would help him, and they talk about Rusty's business, and he offers some advice to Rusty about that business. During that same time, Andrea starts sharing with him details of her daughter's birthday. He is helping her plan this birthday party. They're just continuing to talk about the children. In emails, in conversations, in texts, that's what they talk about, is the children. And on August 29th, you'll see the email where he sends her an email and says, marry me. Now, at this point, they don't even have a physical relationship. At this point, she's made it very clear she's not going to leave Rusty. And then he sends this email. Immediately after that, on August 31st, he goes back to see Rusty again. And he's basically looking to see how this household is, how his children are, how Rusty is raising these children. And after he leaves, the angel comes back. As he's driving home from meeting with Rusty, the angel comes back, and the angel tells him the children are in danger. Rusty is going to hurt the children. You have to protect the children. And that triggers the final delusion. That triggers this delusion that the children are in danger and that it's his job to protect the children. It is his job, his mission, to kill Rusty so that the children will be safe. And from there forward, he's planning. And the district attorney is right. He planned this very carefully. That's what he does. That's what he does for a living. He plans projects. He plans how to get groups of people to make things happen. And that's what he did here. The doctor will tell you, again, delusions don't affect your other behaviors, your other abilities. He begins to plan, just like this is a project at work, just like this is a major project at home. He plans this mission that he has been given to kill Rusty. Now, during this time, he and Andrea, in September, go on a week-long trip to England. He actually offers her, I don't have to go. If you're uncomfortable with what I've told you, if you're uncomfortable with me, I don't have to go. You can go on your own. And she tells him, no, come. They go to England, and they continue talking about the children. They shop for the children while they're in England. They continue making decisions about what she can do to make things easier at home, to make things easier raising the children. They talk about hiring a nanny. They, in his mind, they're co-parenting. In October, he leaves home. He leaves his wife, he leaves his children. And he sends out an email, and you'll have this. It basically, it's to everyone. He sends it to his wife, he sends it to his children, he sends it to his parents, he sends it to his brother and sister, he sends it to a lot of their mutual friends. He sends one email to everyone breaking up with his wife and asking his friends to support her. And this is where you see little hints that there was some of that mania or hypermania, mild mania going on at this same time. He was not what we would call fully manic, but there were some odd behaviors going on at the same time that go along with these delusions. In October, on the 21st, he and Andrea go back to Greenville. And this is almost certainly the point where their relationship becomes physical. That night, they go to dinner and then they go out dancing. You will hear from Christy Oliveira, who was working at the club where they went, and she will tell you they came in and they were like a couple on a date. They were dancing, they were touching, they were kissing, they were acting like a couple out on the dance floor. When they left, she saw them kissing. When Andrea went to the bathroom, Hemy came up to her and was very effusive, telling her, this is great, she's dealing with a real jerk at home, this is just what she needs. He was very, very effusive. And you'll hear from the GE employees that's very different from the way he normally was. When they get back, Andrea starts sending him emails saying, this can't happen again, cuts everything off, making it very clear that this was a mistake. He also meets with a friend right after Greenville won and tells her she gave in. So that's why I'm saying I think this is the point at which, this is where the doctor thinks the relationship actually became physical. Now in November, that relationship cools off. Andrea is mad, Andrea is hurt, Andrea feels guilty, and there is a separation. But at this point, that delusion has set in and has been reinforced by all of these conversations about the children. That delusion is still there, and he is still planning, and he is still working, and on November 18th, he shoots Rusty. At the end of this case, when everything is done, when you've heard all of the evidence, when you have heard from all of the doctors, we will come back. And what we will ask you to do is to return a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. To return a verdict that says that Hemy acted to protect his children and to protect Andrea from the knowledge of what he had done. We ask that you find that Hemy did not have the mental capacity to distinguish between right and wrong. And we ask that he be confined to a state mental institution rather than a prison. We're not asking you to release him. We're not asking you to find him not guilty. We're asking you to find him not guilty by reason of insanity so that he can be confined in a mental institution. Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, before you hear the first witness, I'm going to let you take a brief break in the jury room to be in the neighborhood of 10 minutes. And at this point, do not discuss the case. I'll allow anyone to discuss the case with you. Just go to the jury room and it'll be a break. State, your first witness will be called in 10 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Gary. All right. May be seated.